What happens when an endurance athlete hits the wall, or some people might call it bonking? And so, what happens during your muscles as you're working out and doing sustained strenuous exercise is that they are using up their energy reserves. And so, in every muscle fiber, type 1, type 2A, type 2B, they are using ATP, and at rest, your muscles, for the sake of example, are using about 1 ATP per second. And as soon as you contract these muscles, they ramp that up 100-fold to 100 ATP per second. So basically, those are arbitrary units, but what I want to say here is that the energy demand of your exercising muscle increases dramatically when you are actually contracting it when you're doing exercise. And so what happens in your type 1 muscle fibers, which are the ones that are what is involved for that sustained run, if you're doing a marathon, for instance, or if you're doing a metric century on a bike, you're mostly engaging those type 1 muscles, or you've trained muscles to be more like type 1, because type 1 are the more efficient, more long-lasting, less likely to fatigue muscles. And so what's going on in these specific muscle fibers is that ATP reserve for that initial second disappeared. You have a little bit of creatine present in your muscles, and that creatine gives you that additional second 2 through 10 of your workout. And then after that first 10 seconds, your muscle is going to turn to anaerobic respiration. During this process, this muscle is going to take glucose, it's going to put it through glycolysis. And at the end of glycolysis, we turned 1 glucose into 2 ATP and 2 pyruvates. But in our case, because this is going to be anaerobic respiration, we're not going to actually put that pyruvate into the mitochondria to do the citric acid cycle, because we really don't have the oxygen for it yet, because our heart is still pumping blood. It's still realizing that there's a greater demand for oxygen than there previously was. And so because of that, what's going to happen is that lactic acid fermentation is going to occur. And as this lactic acid fermentation is happening, you are going to be repeating that glycolysis cycle, not going on to the citric acid cycle. And after this, your heart eventually gets enough blood to the muscles where you need them to be. So if you're running, it's going to get into those specific muscles, those type 1 muscles that are firing. And after you get oxygen to these areas, you can do aerobic respiration, which is where you can make use of that citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain to make enormous amounts of ATP from that 1 glucose molecule. So now you're using your energy reserves much more efficiently. But during this process, what's happening is that you're using up glucose. And how are you replenishing that glucose you're using up? The answer is that you turn to glycogen reserves. And so your muscles have glycogen that is basically a stored form of glucose, and they can use this thing called glycogen phosphorylase to take off those glucose molecules from glycogen. And that creates more glucose to keep doing glycolysis, to keep doing the citric acid cycle, to keep doing the electron transport chain in that mitochondria, so you can keep creating ATP, so that your muscles, those type 1 muscle fibers, can continue to contract and keep you running or keep you cycling during these longer periods of time. And so while that's great, what happens when you run out of that glycogen reserve? And when you run out of this glycogen reserve is when you get pretty bad, because you quote unquote hit that wall, because you don't have any more glycogen. And so your muscles are going to have to turn to other things like fatty acids to actually metabolize them to make ATP. And so during fatty acid metabolism, what's happening is your adipose tissue receives a signal from glucagon saying, I'm in the starving or fasting state. And so I'm going to do lipolysis to take the fatty acid, the triacyl glycerols, and put them into the bloodstream so that my muscles can take up these fatty acids. And these muscles can then use those acetyl groups that are on those fatty acids to put that into the matrix of the mitochondria, where we can keep spinning the citric acid cycle and keep the electron transport chain going. And so while you're still able to keep that going and keep some level of ATP present, the issue is that you're not replenishing the levels of pyruvate, which is another key input to the citric acid cycle. And so when you are relying on your muscles' glycogen reserves for energy, the process of turning that glycogen into glucose, which you can then do glycolysis to end up with pyruvate that would go to the TCA cycle, was great because you had pyruvate. But once you run out of glucose, you don't have pyruvate anymore. And so even though you're still able to create some ATP from that fatty acid oxidation, you're not getting that pyruvate back. You've run out of pyruvate, which was an essential input to that TCA cycle. So you're not able to spin the TCA cycle as fast as you previously were when you had those glycogen reserves present. And so that is what happens when you quote unquote hit that wall, because it feels like you just had a huge drop off in energy because your cells are now like, I don't have any more pyruvate. I can't keep my citric acid cycle going anymore. And so we can't keep making ATP at the same level that we used to. And because that demand for ATP is still there, you're still trying to run the next mile, and you're still trying to bike the next mile. You still have that demand, but your body doesn't have a way of meeting that demand and creating that ATP that it needs to keep you going. And so that's what happens when you hit those walls. And so it's the ways to recover from this, if you are in this position, is to basically, like you see pro cyclists do this, you just eat candy bars, and in that moment, just getting the blood sugar levels back up, that glucose is going to get sucked up into that muscle cell and it's going to get burned real quick. So that's a time when candy bars are 100% appropriate to be eating during a race, because that just gives you that immediate energy you need to keep going that next mile if you're running or cycling. And so that's why it's really important. Now, the next question to ask is, how do I avoid getting to that point where I'm bonking or hitting that wall? And the way you do this is you carb load 3 or 4 days prior to the actual event. So let's say we're running a marathon. So what we would want to do is 3 or 4 days before the marathon happens, we want to turn our diet into mostly carbohydrates. So this is stuff like bread, this is stuff like pasta. And so you're basically just taking in a bunch of starch, and what your body's going to do is it's going to take those carbs and it's going to store them into glycogen. And so in the liver, your liver is going to have its own glycogen reserve that it would use to keep the blood sugar levels high during those episodes of fasting or starvation, which is going to be anything longer than 4 hours after a meal. And in your muscles have their own dedicated and exclusive glycogen reserves for themselves. And so what's happening here is that to prevent bonking, your muscles are going to have the most amount of glycogen that they can hold, and your liver is going to have as much glycogen as it can possibly hold because you've done all this carb loading. And then the other thing you're going to do is those 3 or 4 days leading up to that marathon, you're not going to do any strenuous exercise because you want to maintain the glycogen reserves and make them as high as possible prior to this huge event that you're about to have. And so that's how you avoid this stuff. The other thing that comes from your training, this is like the weeks and months leading up to an actual marathon, is that you would have been already developing a lot of your type 1 muscle fibers. And the type 1 muscle fibers have specialized because they have higher amounts of mitochondria in them. They're going to have bigger amounts of glycogen in them. And so by training, you are literally training your type 1 muscle cells to those fibers to have more mitochondria, to have bigger mitochondria, and to have bigger glycogen reserves. And so that is the reason why someone who's trained for a marathon is able to run a marathon. If you took someone who hasn't trained to run a marathon and tried to have them run a marathon, they don't have the glycogen reserves, they don't have the type 1 muscle fibers with the huge numbers of mitochondria that they need, and they don't have the vascularization within those type 1 muscle fibers that someone who's already trained would have. And so that's what training gets you, is it's your body meeting the challenge that you're placing on it as you're preparing to do this huge endurance event. And so I hope this is interesting and helpful stuff. Thank you all for watching. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll talk to you guys next time.